It was a Thursday afternoon, and the late October sky outside the classroom windows glowed a dull gray. Ms. Emily Carter sat at her desk with a half-empty thermos of cold coffee, a red pen clutched between her fingers like a weapon. Midterm grading week always made her irritable. She told herself it was because the kids didn't try hard enough. Deep down, she knew it was more than that. Paper after paper slid under her hand. Sloppy factoring. Wrong graph orientation. Equations that read like guesswork. The red marks bled like wounds across the lined notebook pages. Then she got to it, his paper. The name at the top read, Kendrick Moore. She sighed before even flipping the page. Kendrick was a quiet kid from 5th period Algebra 2, always sitting in the back, hood up, eyes down. Late with homework. Sometimes didn't turn it in at all. But when he did submit, his answers were always strange. Never outright wrong, just different. Like he wasn't solving the questions so much as interpreting them into something else. "Okay, Kendrick," she murmured, flipping the paper over. "Let's see what kind of nonsense we've got today." The problem had been a straightforward quadratic. Solve for x, 2x superscript 2, for x, 6 is equal to 0. Most students applied the quadratic formula or factored it out. But Kendrick's page looked like it belonged in a graduate-level number theory seminar. Her eyes narrowed. The first few lines were somewhat normal, he rearranged terms, but then, instead of simplifying, Kendrick had veered into something else. Symbols not typically used in high school algebra. Summations, radicals with Greek letters, even an integral sign. One section looked like he'd begun sketching a geometric representation of a complex function. To most, it would look like a mistake. But to Emily, it wasn't just gibberish, it was intentional. Purposeful. Then she did something she hadn't done in years, she laughed. It started as a chuckle, dry and sharp, more out of disbelief than amusement. "What is this?" she whispered to herself, looking around the empty room as if someone else might share the moment. Her voice echoed slightly, the classroom long emptied after the final bell. She scrawled a large F on the top corner with a note, "Follow instructions." Then she pushed back from the desk, grabbed her bag, and turned off the overhead lights. As she walked toward the door, something tugged at her. A curiosity she hadn't felt since grad school. She turned back. Her eyes scanned the equation again. There was a transition on the third line, where Kendrick shifted from the known to the unknown. A pattern emerged. Not fully developed, but suggested. Her laughter faded into silence. Her brain, dormant and bitter for years, began to tick. She sat back down. With the classroom dim except for the soft orange glow of the hallway lights through the door's window, Emily bent over Kendrick's paper. She ran her pen along the line he'd written. What was he trying to do here? It wasn't a solution. It was an extension. He'd taken a standard problem and found a doorway in it, a place where logic cracked open into theory. She grabbed a blank sheet of paper and began copying his work line by line. Red pen gave way to blue ink. Her hands moved faster. She didn't understand all of it. Some of it looked like independent formulation, but the symmetry, the direction, it made a kind of sense. Was this just accidental? Or was Kendrick actually trying something new? The red F glared at her like an accusation. She checked the clock. 6:13 p.m. She hadn't meant to stay this late. Her phone buzzed once, her sister. She ignored it. Her eyes were fixed on one line Kendrick had boxed off at the bottom of the page. Where the function bends, truth might follow. She sat still. Not just confused, but moved. That was when she whispered to herself, almost without realizing it. What if it's not wrong? The air was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to fill research labs late at night. The kind of quiet filled with possibility. Still gripping the paper, she stood and looked at the board. With a piece of chalk, she began writing out Kendrick's equations, letting her hand guide her memory. The sound of chalk scraping brought something alive in her, something long buried beneath years of teaching and bills and disappointment. Halfway through the first expression, she froze. It resembled an identity. Something she had once read in a thesis paper at a math symposium in Chicago 10 years ago. A theory left incomplete because no one could solve the convergence sequence. Kendrick was picking up from there. It couldn't be coincidence. She turned, stared at the desk where the F still sat. A sudden flush of guilt ran through her. The next morning, Kendrick showed up to class, same as always, hood up, backpack slung low, eyes tired. Ms. Carter watched him enter, her mind replaying the equations from the night before. She tried to catch his eye, but he never looked at her. She passed back the graded homework at the end of class. Kendrick barely glanced at his before sliding it into his folder. She hesitated. She could have said something, should have. But the words stuck. What could she say? That she'd stayed up thinking about his math? That his mistake wasn't a mistake? Instead, she just said, "See you tomorrow, Kendrick." He gave a tiny nod. And left. After the bell rang and the classroom emptied, Emily returned to her desk. She picked up Kendrick's homework again and stared at the bold red F at the top. She turned the page over and began writing on the back. Kendrick. I'd like to talk to you about your process on question number 3. Can you stay after class tomorrow? She paused, then added. P.S. What did you mean by, where the function bends? She folded the page and slipped it into a new folder labeled More, Kendrick. Then she placed it gently in her drawer. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She hadn't thought about her abandoned dissertation in over 5 years. But now, a student had made her think again. A quiet kid from West Detroit who barely said a word. Might have just rewritten the opening to a theory no one had finished. And she had almost laughed it away. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Kendrick Moore didn't talk much at school, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he'd learned the hard way that most people weren't listening. The world he came from didn't reward the kind of curiosity that kept him up at night with notebooks full of unproven math theories and page corners scribbled with invisible variables. Out here, in the real world, the world of cracked sidewalks, corner stores with bulletproof glass, and police sirens that howled like lullabies, you learned early that blending in was survival. His mornings began with the low hum of the radiator in the cramped apartment he shared with his mother and little sister, Aaliyah. Most days, his mom was already gone by the time he got up. She worked the night shift at Sinai Grace, leaving Kendrick to get Aaliyah ready for school. That Friday, like most others, started with him heating water for instant oatmeal while Aaliyah braided her doll's hair at the kitchen table. You got math today? She asked, munching dry cereal straight from the box. Every day's math, Kendrick mumbled, pouring hot water into a chipped bowl. She giggled. You still doing that weird homework? The one with the little rocket symbols? He smirked, just a little. Those are not rockets. They're integrals. She blinked at him. You sound like Grandma. At that, he paused. The spoon in his hand tapped the edge of the bowl. Something in his chest tightened. I'll walk you to the bus, he said, changing the subject. He didn't like to talk about Grandma Estelle much. She'd been gone 3 years now, but her presence lingered in everything. The second-hand bookshelf packed with her old teaching manuals, the cracked chalkboard hung unevenly in the hallway, the floor tiles still stained from where she used to grade papers with coffee and red pen. Estelle Moore had been a high school math teacher on the East Side. Known for being tough as hell but fair. She was the first person to realize Kendrick wasn't just smart, he was different. When he was 8, she caught him copying the Pythagorean theorem out of her old college textbook and rearranging it into something else entirely. Instead of scolding him for doodling in her book, she handed him a piece of chalk and pointed to the blackboard. "Go on," she said. "Show me." From that day on, they had a ritual. Every Sunday, she'd write a problem on the board and Kendrick would try to solve it without her help. When he couldn't, she'd guide him, not give him answers, but questions. Questions that made him think sideways. He never solved the last problem she gave him. It was still there, ghosted faintly on the board under layers of newer scribbles. What lies between the limits we assume? He never figured out what she meant. But sometimes, late at night, he'd lie in bed with that question circling his mind like a moth around a dying bulb. At school, Kendrick kept his head down. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't stay for clubs. He walked the halls like someone trying not to be noticed. But that didn't mean he wasn't watching. He noticed everything, especially Ms. Carter. She was different from the other teachers. Not in an obvious way. She didn't wear bright clothes or throw candy at students to get their attention. But she moved with a kind of silence, like she was always somewhere else in her mind. And she looked at students, not just past them. Still, Kendrick didn't trust her. No one from his world made it through this system without getting laughed at, dismissed, or worse, used. So, when she handed back his homework that morning with a folded note inside, he didn't open it right away. He waited until lunch, tucked away in the stairwell between the gym and the boiler room, the one place nobody came during fourth period. He unfolded the paper slowly. Her handwriting was neat, clear. "Kendrick. I'd like to talk to you about your process on question number 3. Can you stay after class tomorrow?" He stared at it. She'd underlined, process. Not answer. That was new. He flipped the note over. P.S. What did you mean by, where the function bends? He wasn't sure if she was mocking him or not. The quote had just come to him while he worked. He liked the idea that equations weren't rigid, that they could bend. That if you looked at them just right, maybe the truth wasn't behind them, but in the act of twisting them until they revealed something new. But how do you explain that to someone who already gave you an F? He slid the paper into his binder and sat there, listening to the steam hiss in the pipes overhead. He didn't know what to do. Trusting people wasn't something he was good at. Still, there was something about the way she asked. That afternoon, he didn't go straight home after school. Instead, he walked. Past the 7-Eleven, past the chain-link fences of abandoned lots, past the corner where his cousin got jumped last summer. He ended up at the neighborhood library. Not many people went there anymore. The computers were slow, and the carpet smelled like mold. But they had a math section no one touched. Kendrick liked that. He found an old dusty book, Mathematical Curiosities by someone named Rademacher, and opened it to a chapter about prime spirals. He copied a diagram into his notebook, then added his own adjustments, tiny shifts in angle, extrapolations he couldn't yet prove. But it made sense to him. It always did, even if he couldn't explain it to anyone else. By the time he left, the sky had turned the color of bruised lavender, and streetlights blinked on like slow winks. He tucked his notebook under his arm and started the walk home. That night, while Aaliyah slept with her head resting against a stuffed unicorn, Kendrick sat at the tiny kitchen table and flipped to a fresh page. He wrote 3 words at the top, like a title. The Estelle sequence. He didn't know if it would become anything. But it was a start. It felt like something real. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone in it. The next day felt longer than usual, as if time itself was dragging its feet through a thick layer of fog. Kendrick couldn't shake the feeling that Miss Carter's note had been a mistake, some kind of strange error that would somehow be corrected in the next class. But when the bell rang, he found himself walking up to her desk, where she was still sorting through piles of papers. You wanted to talk to me?" Kendrick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried not to look her in the eye, but couldn't help it. There was something about her calm demeanor that made him feel small, like he was somehow out of place in a world of numbers and equations that only made sense to him when no one was looking. Ms. Carter looked up from her desk, her eyes thoughtful but not judgmental. She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't feel forced or like it was hiding something. "Yes, Kendrick. I wanted to discuss your homework from yesterday, specifically the work you did on that quadratic." Kendrick frowned. "My homework? The one with the integrals and the weird symbols?" She nodded. "Exactly. I'd like to understand your thought process behind that. Most students just solve the equation with the quadratic formula. But you," she paused and placed her hands on the edge of the desk, leaning forward just slightly. "You took a different approach. And I'm curious to know why." Kendrick swallowed. He wasn't sure if she was mocking him or if she genuinely wanted to understand what he was thinking. He had never been in a position where someone, especially a teacher, was genuinely interested in his ideas. The walls he had built to keep people out seemed to crumble with every word she said. "I don't know," Kendrick said quietly, trying to sound confident. "It's just, the formula didn't really make sense to me, you know. So, I tried to see if there was another way to look at it. Something that maybe made more sense." Ms. Carter nodded. "I see." She sat back, and for a moment, Kendrick thought she was going to say something dismissive, maybe suggest that he should stick to the formulas, but she didn't. Instead, she asked, "Have you considered what happens when you look at equations from different perspectives? Not just as problems to solve, but as patterns to explore?" Kendrick hesitated. "Patterns? I don't really understand what you mean." She smiled again, and Kendrick was surprised to see her eyes light up a little. "It's okay. Most people don't think that way at first. But sometimes, the best discoveries happen when you stop trying to solve something and instead look at it as a series of relationships, shifting parts that connect and break apart, depending on how you move them around. Like the difference between solving a puzzle and discovering a new game." That was a lot to take in. Kendrick looked down at the desk, his hands feeling suddenly clammy. This wasn't like anything he had ever heard before. He wasn't used to talking about math in this way, where it was more about connections than answers. Ms. Carter leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "I'm curious, Kendrick, you didn't just throw those symbols in there to confuse me, did you?" Kendrick's heart skipped a beat. "No. I mean, not really. It's just, I thought maybe there was a way to go beyond the problem. Like I could connect it to something bigger. I don't know if that makes sense." It didn't make sense to him, not completely, but there was something about the way Ms. Carter looked at him, like she actually believed there was something in what he was saying. She didn't laugh. She didn't mock him. She just listened. And for the first time in a long while, Kendrick felt the weight of his own thoughts become something worth hearing. "You're not wrong," she said finally, her voice steady. "I think you're onto something. Your work isn't just creative, it's actually quite advanced. Have you ever considered going deeper into math? Like, beyond high school? Maybe even in a university setting?" Kendrick stared at her, his mind whirling. This wasn't happening. A teacher was telling him that what he was doing, something that had always seemed so strange and isolated to him, might actually have value. Kendrick couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of his lips. He didn't know what to say. "I don't know," he muttered after a long pause. "I never really thought about college. My mom, she always says I should just focus on getting through high school." Ms. Carter nodded, but her expression softened. "I understand that. But what if you could do more? You have a gift, Kendrick. I've seen it before. You think in ways most students don't, and that kind of thinking can take you places." He didn't respond right away. It was hard to hear someone say that when all he'd ever been told was that people like him didn't get places, not in the way she was talking about. But there was something in her voice, something in her belief that made him want to believe it too. "Let's make a deal," Miss Carter said after a moment. "I'll help you find some resources, some books, maybe even a mentor if you're interested. But I need you to promise me one thing." Kendrick raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "That you'll keep pushing yourself," she said, her tone serious. "That you won't stop looking at math the way you do. Because what you see, what you feel, could change things. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Especially not me." Kendrick didn't know what to say. He wanted to ask a million questions. He wanted to know what she meant by change things, and how he could even begin to understand this new world she was suggesting to him. But instead, all he could manage was a simple nod. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll try." Ms. Carter smiled, and for the first time, Kendrick thought it looked genuine, not the smile of a teacher who was just being polite, but the smile of someone who actually cared. "Good. I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with, Kendrick." As the bell rang and the students began to shuffle out of the room, Kendrick stood there for a moment, still processing everything. When he walked out into the hallway, the noise of chattering students felt distant, as if he was hearing it through a thick layer of glass. His thoughts were somewhere else, on that note MS. Carter had written, on the work he had done the night before, and on the possibility that, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he had always felt. For the first time in a long time, Kendrick didn't feel alone in his curiosity. And that thought, that small, fleeting thought, made him realize that maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than the world around him had ever seen. Kendrick couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief that lingered long after Ms. Carter's conversation. It wasn't that he didn't believe her. In fact, for the first time, he felt like someone had seen him, really seen him, beyond the surface of his grades or his quiet demeanor. It was more that the idea of someone, especially someone like him, from where he was from, being good enough for something more seemed both exhilarating and terrifying at once. That night, after getting Aaliyah to bed, Kendrick sat at the kitchen table again, flipping through his notebook. The diagram he had drawn for his math theory, what he jokingly dubbed the Estelle sequence, was still staring back at him. Each line felt familiar, like the thread of a story he hadn't finished yet. He stared at the numbers, the symbols, the shapes that swirled on the page. Everything had a purpose. It wasn't just math, it was a language he could feel in his bones. The more he looked at it, the more it made sense. But the more it made sense, the more daunting it became. The intricacies of what he had started were so complex, so unlike anything he'd seen in textbooks or online resources. He couldn't help but wonder, could this be real? He didn't have an answer to that yet. But as his pen hovered over the paper, Kendrick realized something else. Ms. Carter hadn't just given him a suggestion to go deeper into his math studies. She had given him permission. Permission to explore. To think beyond the boundaries of what he had been taught. She had ignited something inside him, and he couldn't just ignore it. After a few more minutes of scribbling formulas and looking for connections that weren't immediately apparent, Kendrick grabbed his backpack and walked out of the apartment. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. It wasn't like there was much to say anyway. His mom worked late, and Aaliyah was probably already asleep, buried in her stuffed animals. He walked through the still streets of West Detroit, his mind racing. The quiet of the evening matched the quiet in his head. There were no distractions, no loud voices to drown out his thoughts. Just him and the empty sidewalk stretching ahead. As he neared the small corner library, his usual escape from the noise of the world, he saw a light flickering inside. It was almost as if the library had been waiting for him. He hesitated for a second, then pushed the door open. The librarian, Mrs. Wright, barely looked up from her desk. "Back again, Kendrick," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. He nodded, keeping his voice low. "Yeah. Just, need something to read." Mrs. Wright had been a fixture of the library for years. She knew everyone in the neighborhood, but she also knew the ones who needed quiet. Kendrick was one of those people. He didn't come for the books everyone else borrowed, he came for the ones nobody seemed to notice. As he wandered through the aisles of dusty old books, his fingers brushed against the spines of volumes on mathematics and physics. Some of these books were older than his mother, some had yellowed pages that crackled when you turned them. But it didn't matter. Kendrick wasn't looking for anything particular. He was looking for answers. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound book on advanced number theory. It was a title he had never seen before, Nonlinear Dynamics and the Theory of Chaos. The cover was worn, the corners bent. Perfect. Kendrick flipped it open, and immediately the dense, complex text drew him in. Words like fractals, strange attractors, and bifurcation leapt off the page, causing his heart to beat faster. For hours, he sat there, flipping through the book, scribbling notes in his notebook, and trying to understand the ideas behind the words. The book was dense, and some parts of it made his head spin, but it was also full of patterns, ideas that felt familiar. Ideas that connected with the sequence he had begun to sketch out. He wasn't sure yet how, but he could feel it. There was something in there that could change everything. "Mr. Moore, don't you have somewhere to be?" Mrs. Wright's voice interrupted his thoughts. He glanced up and saw her standing at the front desk, a bemused expression on her face. Kendrick glanced at his watch and realized that it was already after midnight. The library was nearly empty. He stood up, stretching his arms above his head. "Yeah, I guess I lost track of time." Mrs. Wright chuckled. "That happens when you find something worth getting lost in. Just remember, this place isn't open forever." He nodded, slipping the book back onto the shelf. There was no need to check it out, it was just a stopgap for tonight. Kendrick had made his decision. He would take the theories he'd found and push them further. He would dig deeper, ask questions nobody had asked before. Because something inside him was telling him that the answer was within reach. That what he was doing mattered. As he walked back to his apartment, Kendrick felt something new, an excitement he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was the same feeling he used to get when he solved a problem Grandma Estelle had written on the blackboard. The feeling of discovery, of seeing things with new eyes. He was no longer just solving equations. He was uncovering something bigger, something that hadn't been seen before. And that something was waiting to be explored. When he got home, Kendrick sat down at the kitchen table again, but this time, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like the odd kid in class. He was Kendrick Moore, the kid with the answers, the kid who thought differently. And that was enough for now. It had to be. He grabbed his pen and notebook and began writing down everything he had learned in the library. The formulas, the patterns, the connections. Everything started to come together in a way that felt like a story unfolding. A story that only he could tell. The numbers on the page seemed to shift and rearrange, as if they were alive. And for the first time in a long time, Kendrick believed that maybe, just maybe, they were. The days after Kendrick's visit to the library blurred into each other like pages turning too quickly. Every free moment he had, he spent buried in his notebook, his head spinning with equations, patterns, and the strange new world he had stumbled into. It was a kind of obsession that was both exhilarating and terrifying. What if Miss Carter was right? What if this really was something worth pursuing? But Kendrick didn't talk about it. He couldn't, not yet. Not until he was sure. He didn't want to get anyone's hopes up, or worse, get laughed at. Even Aaliyah, who usually begged for his attention, noticed something different about him. There was a quiet focus about him that hadn't been there before, and she was too young to fully understand it, but she could feel it. She stopped asking him for help with her homework every time he sat down at the table. Instead, she would sit beside him, drawing pictures, her little crayon scratching against the paper as Kendrick scribbled equations in the margins of his own work. Kendrick barely noticed her presence. His world had become one of numbers and ideas, and the more he dived into it, the more the real world felt like a distant memory. But his thoughts always returned to one person, Ms. Carter. The day she'd called him into her office had lingered in his mind like a flickering candle in the dark. Her words were still fresh, ringing in his ears like a promise he wasn't sure he was ready to keep. She hadn't just seen his work, she'd seen him. The real him, the one who had never been good at fitting in, the one who could never find his place in the world of other kids. But Ms. Carter had seen something in him that even Kendrick hadn't seen yet. And for the first time, he felt like he had permission to dream. That Thursday, after school, Kendrick stayed behind in the classroom, trying to finish his math homework before going home. The classroom emptied out as usual, and Kendrick thought he would be alone. But as he was gathering his things, Ms. Carter walked over to his desk, her footsteps light on the tiled floor. "Hey, Kendrick," she said, her voice casual but warm. "How's it going?" Kendrick looked up, startled by the sound of her voice. He didn't expect her to approach him so soon after their conversation. He had half thought she would leave him to figure it out on his own, but instead, she was still here, still curious. "It's going okay," Kendrick said, trying to sound casual, even though his heart was racing. "I'm just, working on some of the problems." She leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Kendrick raised an eyebrow, unsure what she was about to say. "What's up?" She hesitated for a second, her eyes scanning his work. "You know, Kendrick, I've been looking at that theory you wrote down, the one with the quadratic and the integrals. It's really impressive. Do you mind if I ask where you came up with it?" Kendrick's stomach dropped. He hadn't expected her to mention it so soon, and now he was caught off guard. For a moment, he couldn't think of what to say. He didn't want to sound crazy. He didn't want to tell her that he had just stumbled upon it, or that he hadn't really known what he was doing at first. But the truth was, he couldn't ignore what had been happening in his mind. The ideas had been building up for days, almost as if they had been waiting for the right moment to burst free. I don't really know," Kendrick stammered, suddenly feeling very self-conscious. "I mean, I didn't just, make it up. I started thinking about patterns, like you said. And then, it just, clicked." Ms. Carter nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the pages in front of her. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "Look, Kendrick. What you've done here is impressive, and I've been talking to a few people about it." Her voice dropped to a more serious tone. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I think you're onto something. Something big." Kendrick felt his breath catch in his throat. "Big? Like, what do you mean?" Ms. Carter looked him squarely in the eye. "I think this is more than just a high school homework problem. You've stumbled across a set of connections that could change the way we think about certain types of equations. These are the kinds of ideas that could shape entire fields of study. And I don't say that lightly." Kendrick's mind was spinning. He had always known that his thinking was different, but this was something else entirely. Was she serious? The idea that what he was doing could actually have an impact, could actually matter, was almost too much to process. "What does that mean?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "What am I supposed to do with it?" "MS." Carter smiled, but it wasn't the reassuring smile she had given him before. This was different. It was a smile that came with a challenge. "You keep going. You explore this. You see where it takes you. You take it seriously, Kendrick, because it's real. I can help you get the resources you need, but this is something you'll have to take ownership of. No one else can do this for you." Her words hung in the air like a weight, heavy and undeniable. Kendrick felt a spark of something, hope, fear, excitement, all mixed together. But there was something else too, a deep sense of uncertainty. He had never considered that his work might actually mean something outside of the classroom. Could he really do this? Could he take this theory beyond the small world he had created for himself? Before he could speak again, Miss Carter stood up and gave him a final look. Think about it, Kendrick. I'll be here to guide you, but this is your journey. You can decide whether or not to take the next step. And with that, she was gone, leaving Kendrick alone in the empty classroom with the sound of his own heartbeat filling his ears. For a long time, Kendrick didn't move. His mind was racing, replaying her words over and over again. She believed in him. Ms. Carter believed that he could do something no one else had ever done before. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back of the room anymore. He was Kendrick Moore, the kid who had the potential to change the way the world looked at math. But that realization was both a gift and a burden. It was one thing to have a theory. It was another thing entirely to bring it to life. As Kendrick gathered his things and left the classroom, he felt a mix of fear and excitement building inside him. This was the beginning of something. But the question was, what exactly would it be? Kendrick didn't sleep much that night. The words Ms. Carter had spoken to him echoed in his mind, filling his thoughts with possibilities he never imagined for himself. Could it really be true? Could this sequence of numbers and equations actually lead to something groundbreaking? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but so did the spark of excitement. He could feel something stirring inside him, something he had never felt before, an urge to prove that he was more than just the kid who sat quietly at the back of the class. It wasn't just the idea of math anymore. It was the idea of him. Of his potential. The next day at school, Kendrick couldn't focus on anything else. As much as he tried to pay attention to the lesson, the numbers danced in his mind, refusing to let him go. He stared out the window during history class, pretending to take notes, but in reality, he was mentally dissecting the theory from the night before. He could hear Ms. Carter's voice in his head, "You take it seriously, this is your journey." But where was he supposed to start? He had no idea how to take something so abstract and turn it into something real. He didn't know what resources to tap into, who to talk to, or how to even begin formalizing his ideas. Every math teacher he had known in the past had been focused on textbook problems, not original theory. The bell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was lunchtime, and Kendrick wasn't hungry. He could already feel his nerves building as he walked toward the cafeteria, knowing that he needed to talk to someone, but not just anyone. He needed to talk to Miss Carter again. He needed guidance. As he reached the door to the cafeteria, he spotted Ms. Carter standing by the entrance, talking to a few of the other teachers. She caught his eye and gave him a small wave. Kendrick hesitated for a moment but then made his way over. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice low but urgent. She smiled when she saw him. "Hey, Kendrick. You doing all right?" Kendrick wasn't sure where to start. He didn't want to sound too eager or too naive, but he couldn't hold it in anymore. "I've been thinking about what you said, and I want to keep going. I don't really know how, but I want to try." Ms. Carter's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, away from the other teachers. "I'm glad to hear that. It's normal to feel a little lost at first. This is a big leap, Kendrick. But you're not alone in it." Kendrick felt a surge of relief. He had expected her to brush him off, to tell him he needed to wait until he had a more solid idea or a more concrete plan. But she was encouraging him. She was giving him space to figure it out in his own time. "I don't know where to start," Kendrick admitted. "I don't even know if this is something real. I mean, I can see the connections, but I don't know how to prove them." Ms. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "It's okay. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Let's start with this: you have the kernel of an idea, right? You have something that works on paper. The next step is to test it. Start building on what you've already found. See where it leads. Test it." Kendrick repeated, unsure of what she meant. "How?" "Well, think about it like this," she said, her eyes lighting up as she spoke. "What you're working on isn't just a formula, it's a hypothesis. A theory about how certain patterns work. To test it, you'll need to apply it. Start solving problems, creating equations based on what you found, and see if the theory holds up. If it doesn't, then you know you need to refine it. But if it does, she trailed off, allowing the weight of the implication to hang in the air. Kendrick felt a thrill of anticipation. So this was how it worked. It wasn't just about finding something that worked on paper. It was about proving it. Testing it. And, in some ways, he realized, that was the easy part. I can do that, he said, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Ms. Carter smiled back. I know you can. But remember, Kendrick, this is going to take time. Don't rush it. You'll hit walls. You'll get frustrated. But every time you do, that's when you learn. That's when you grow. And I'll be here if you need help. But this is your path to walk. Kendrick nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to happen overnight. But he was ready for the challenge. As he turned to leave, Miss Carter called after him. Oh, and Kendrick. He turned back, meeting her gaze. Whatever happens with this, don't let anyone make you doubt what you're doing. You've got something special. You have to believe that. Her words settled into him like a weight, but not a burden, a gift. Kendrick walked away from the cafeteria feeling different. He had always been someone who stayed in the shadows, never drawing attention to himself. But now, he felt like he was on the edge of something bigger than himself. Later that afternoon, Kendrick found himself at the kitchen table again, notebook in front of him. Aaliyah was doing her usual thing, flipping through a picture book, occasionally looking over at him to see if he was paying attention to her. He wasn't, not this time. He had already decided that he would dedicate himself fully to figuring this out, whatever it took. He began by breaking down his original equations. He didn't understand all of them, not yet, but he knew that there were pieces missing, gaps that he needed to fill in. Every number, every symbol, felt like a puzzle piece waiting to fit into place. For hours, Kendrick worked. He scribbled notes, scratched out numbers, and tried different approaches, sometimes getting nowhere, other times stumbling across a connection that felt right. It was frustrating and exhilarating all at once. But with each mistake, with each failed attempt, Kendrick felt his understanding deepening. He wasn't just working through math problems. He was learning. As the night wore on, Kendrick realized something: he wasn't alone in this. He had Miss Carter's support, even if it was just a few words of encouragement. And most importantly, he had his own mind. And that, he realized, was enough. The next few days were a blur of equations, scribbled notes, and late-night sessions at the kitchen table. Kendrick's mind had been consumed by the theory Ms. Carter had pushed him to explore. He couldn't stop thinking about the implications. What if this was it? What if this was the breakthrough he had been waiting for his entire life? But that thought, as exciting as it was, also made him nervous. He didn't want to be disappointed. He didn't want to fail. His mind raced in the quiet hours of the evening. He could almost hear Ms. Carter's voice telling him, test it. Build on it. See if it holds up. That was the only way to know if what he had discovered was real. And yet, the fear of failure held him back. What if it didn't work? What if he couldn't make the pieces fit? Kendrick knew that testing the theory would be the hardest part. Testing was always the hardest part. It was easy to have an idea. But putting that idea into practice, making sure it stood up to scrutiny, was a whole other challenge. Still, Kendrick couldn't stop. He couldn't walk away. Not now. He had to know. On Monday afternoon, he stayed after class, just as he had the day Ms. Carter had spoken to him. The classroom emptied out, leaving Kendrick alone with his thoughts. He opened his notebook again and stared at the equations, wondering if they would reveal more now that he was looking at them with fresh eyes. Just as he was about to make a new note, Ms. Carter walked over, her footsteps soft on the tile floor. She was carrying a stack of papers, but her gaze was immediately drawn to the open notebook in front of Kendrick. "So, how's it going?" she asked, settling into the chair next to him. Kendrick rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "I've been trying to work through it, but I feel like I'm missing something. I've tried applying the theory to a few problems, but some of them just don't seem to fit. It's not wrong, but it's not quite right either." Ms. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "That's normal. The first steps are always the toughest. But I think you're on the right track." She paused for a moment, considering her next words. "It might help if you approach it from a different angle. Have you tried looking at it from a real-world application? Try testing the theory in a way that could be applied to something tangible. Sometimes that can open up new pathways." Kendrick's eyes widened. Real-world application? It was like a light bulb had gone off in his head. He had been so focused on the abstract side of the theory, on the numbers and equations themselves, that he hadn't considered how they could be used outside of a classroom setting. He sat up straighter. "You mean, use it in something real? Like, in physics or engineering?" Ms. Carter smiled. "Exactly. Sometimes the best way to test a theory is to see if it works in the real world. If it holds up under real-world conditions, then you know you're onto something." Kendrick felt a wave of excitement wash over him. This was exactly what he needed, an experiment, a test he could use to measure whether or not his theory was valid. But how could he apply math to something real? He wasn't an expert in any field like physics or engineering. He barely knew the first thing about applying advanced math to practical problems. Ms. Carter must have sensed his hesitation. "Start small," she suggested. "Look at something simple. Maybe even something in your own life. It doesn't have to be big or complicated. If you can make the theory work on a smaller scale, then you can build from there." Kendrick thought about it for a moment. Then, an idea popped into his head. It wasn't a huge experiment. It wasn't groundbreaking. But it was a start. He closed his notebook and stood up, collecting his things. "Thanks, Miss Carter. I think I've got an idea. I'll start testing it with something personal." Ms. Carter gave him an encouraging nod. "Good. Keep me posted, okay?" Kendrick didn't wait for her to finish speaking. He was already walking out the door, his mind racing with possibilities. He had something to test. Something real. That night, Kendrick sat at the kitchen table again, his notebook open before him. This time, however, he wasn't looking at the equations themselves. Instead, he was thinking about how he could use them to explain a real-world problem. As he sat there, staring at the numbers, he remembered something he had heard once in a documentary about the way engineers used math to design bridges. They didn't just rely on theoretical calculations, they used practical applications to ensure their designs worked in the real world. The math wasn't just on paper, it had to stand up to real-world pressure, real-world conditions. Kendrick's eyes flicked to the window. The old oak tree in his backyard, which he had climbed as a child, caught his attention. The tree's branches had always intrigued him, the way they grew at different angles, the way they stretched out to reach the sun. He had seen how the weight of the branches caused certain ones to bend, the way some parts of the tree held stronger than others. Could he apply his theory to that? He grabbed a pencil and started to sketch a simple model of the tree. He imagined it as a system of branches, each connected to a central trunk, and began to apply his theory to the way the branches grew. He considered the forces at play, gravity, wind, the angle of the branches, and how they supported each other. Could his equations explain the way the tree's structure worked? The more Kendrick thought about it, the more the numbers seemed to line up. His theory began to explain how the different parts of the tree compensated for each other's weight. The larger branches supported the smaller ones, and the trunk was the anchor that held everything together. He began writing down equations that described the forces acting on the tree, calculating how different variables influenced the strength of each branch. It wasn't perfect. But it was a start. Kendrick could feel his excitement growing again. This was something real. He was applying his theory to something tangible, something that existed outside the confines of the classroom. He spent hours on that model, adjusting the numbers and making calculations, tweaking his equations until they fit. There were still gaps. There were still parts he didn't fully understand. But he was testing it, and that was the most important part. At last, Kendrick closed his notebook, exhausted but satisfied. He had taken the first step. And that, he knew, was just the beginning. The following day, Kendrick couldn't concentrate at school. Every moment between classes felt like a waste of time, an interruption in the flow of his thoughts. His notebook was filled with pages of notes, calculations, and sketches, but it still didn't feel complete. He had tested the theory on the tree, as Ms. Carter had suggested, but something about it felt off. The numbers were close enough that he could sense the pattern, but not exact. And he needed exact. During lunch, he found himself sitting alone in the corner of the cafeteria, the familiar hum of conversation and laughter around him almost deafening in comparison to his thoughts. Kendrick wasn't hungry. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten and actually enjoyed it. His mind kept returning to the equations, running them over and over again, trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through the pages. The tree model was there, but it felt incomplete. The equations, while accurate, weren't quite right. He had to refine them. But how? Then, something hit him, like a spark that lit a fire in his mind. What if the issue wasn't the model itself? What if it was how he was applying the theory to the model? What if the force acting on the tree wasn't just gravity or the weight distribution, but something else entirely? Something more subtle. Kendrick's thoughts raced as he considered the possibility. What if there was a hidden variable he hadn't accounted for yet? Something small, almost insignificant, but critical to the equation. He closed his eyes and visualized the tree again. The branches, the trunk, the leaves. The way they interacted with the environment. He saw the wind rustling through the branches, causing them to sway. That was it, wind. The force of the wind was something he hadn't factored in. The tree's structure had to account for the added stress of external forces. The theory wasn't just about weight distribution, it was about how the tree responded to external forces over time. Kendrick's eyes shot open. He grabbed his pencil and started scribbling furiously in his notebook, revising the equations. The wind, he realized, created a dynamic force. It wasn't a constant like gravity, but it could be measured by its fluctuations. If he could account for wind speed and direction in his model, it might make everything fall into place. The more Kendrick worked, the more the theory started to make sense. His equations became more complex, but they also felt more real. He was no longer simply trying to match numbers, he was describing an actual system, a living, breathing organism responding to its environment. And that was when it clicked. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, but Kendrick barely noticed. He was too busy deep in thought, furiously writing down the new equations, testing different variables. This was it. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. But there was still one thing left to do, verify it. He had a new idea, but now he had to test it again. This time, he needed more than just the tree. He needed something bigger. Something that would allow him to push his theory to its limits. He didn't have to think for long. Kendrick knew exactly what he needed to do next. That afternoon, Kendrick found himself walking to the library after school, his mind set on one thing. Testing the new application of his theory. He couldn't wait to see if it would work outside the confines of his notebook. The library was quiet, its familiar smell of books and old wood filling the air. Kendrick sat down at one of the tables near the back, pulling out his notebook and flipping through it until he found the equations he needed. He had tested them on the tree, but now he needed to apply them to something else, a real-world problem that would push the limits of his theory. Kendrick glanced around the library. Then, as if by fate, his eyes landed on something. The science section. It was full of books on physics, engineering, and the natural world, everything he could possibly need to test his new hypothesis. But he didn't need a book. He needed data. And he knew exactly where to get it. He quickly stood up and made his way to the library's computers. Kendrick pulled up the university's database, where they stored scientific papers and research. He had access because of his advanced math credits, a privilege that felt both strange and empowering. It was as though he had entered a new world, a world where he had a seat at the table of real scientists, real researchers. Kendrick searched for studies on tree structures, environmental forces on plant life, and engineering designs based on natural forms. After browsing for a while, he found a study on the way engineers used natural systems, like trees, vines, and even bones, to design stronger structures. It was a breakthrough in biomimicry, the study of how nature's solutions to problems could be used in modern engineering. Kendrick opened the paper and began to read. The more he read, the more he realized that his theory was close to something already being applied in the real world. There were parallels between the way trees distributed forces and the way engineers designed bridges and skyscrapers. His theory wasn't just about a single tree anymore, it was about understanding how natural systems responded to the forces of nature, and how those principles could be used in the human-made world. The excitement was overwhelming. Kendrick had been right all along. He wasn't just working on some abstract math problem, he was working on something that had real-world applications. He could see the connections now. His equations could be the key to understanding a new approach to building structures, stronger, more efficient, and more sustainable than ever before. As Kendrick sat there, the full scope of what he had discovered began to sink in. He wasn't just a high school student trying to make sense of a set of equations anymore. He was on the verge of something monumental. Something that could change the way people thought about engineering and the natural world. But as he sat there, feeling on top of the world, a new realization hit him: this wasn't just his discovery anymore. He had to share it. He had to show someone. He needed to take the next step, find someone who could help him refine the theory, someone who could guide him in taking it further. And that meant reaching out to experts, to real professionals, not just Ms. Carter. He wasn't sure who to turn to yet, but he knew he couldn't keep this to himself. This was just the beginning. Kendrick packed up his things and left the library with a sense of purpose. The world was waiting for him now, and he was ready to take the next step. The next few days seemed to drag on endlessly for Kendrick. His mind was consumed by the equations, by the theory, by the possibilities. Each moment felt like a step closer to something bigger, but also a step closer to something that might collapse under the weight of its own ambition. As much as he was excited, Kendrick couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he might be overlooking something crucial. His afternoon at the library had been enlightening. The connections he had made between his theory and biomimicry in engineering were groundbreaking. It was as if a whole new world had opened up before him. But there was one thing he hadn't anticipated: the moment when the theory would no longer be just a personal discovery, but a living, breathing challenge that others would scrutinize. Kendrick had always loved the isolation of math. The quiet certainty of numbers, the peace of solving problems alone. But now, for the first time, he understood that math could be a battleground, a place where ideas were tested, contested, and sometimes shattered under the harsh light of reality. And he was about to step right into that battleground. The challenge came in the form of an unexpected email late one evening. Kendrick had just finished dinner, his plate still in front of him, when his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the name of the sender, Dr. Philip Carver, Ph.D. Kendrick squinted at the message. He opened it, half expecting it to be spam or another marketing email. But when he read it, his heart skipped a beat. Subject: Inquiry regarding your mathematical theory. Dear Kendrick, I came across your recent submission of a mathematical model to the Open Research Forum regarding the dynamics of force distribution in natural structures. Specifically, the model you presented on the weight distribution in tree structures caught my attention. As a researcher in the field of structural engineering, I find your approach intriguing, though I do have some concerns regarding the validity of your initial assumptions. Specifically, I question how your equations account for dynamic environmental factors, such as wind shear and seismic activity. These variables can significantly affect the stability of structures, and I believe they might alter the assumptions you've made in your model. If you're interested in refining your theory, I would suggest further empirical testing and perhaps collaboration with experts in the field. I look forward to your thoughts on this. Best regards. Dr. Philip Carver, Ph.D. Senior Researcher, Structural Engineering. Kendrick stared at the screen, a mix of excitement and apprehension flooding through him. The email was professional, courteous, but the implications were clear. Someone with expertise in the field had seen his work, and had some serious doubts about it. Dr. Carver had brought up wind shear and seismic activity, both of which were crucial factors that Kendrick hadn't considered yet. For a moment, Kendrick felt the weight of doubt creeping in. Was his theory flawed? Was this really all just a mistake? But then, the other part of him, the part that had driven him to continue this far, pushed those thoughts aside. He wasn't going to let one challenge stop him. This wasn't just a moment to back down. It was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to prove that his theory had merit. Kendrick's mind raced as he began crafting a response. He was careful with his words, wanting to make sure he addressed Dr. Carver's concerns without sounding defensive. Subject: Inquiry regarding your mathematical theory. Dear Dr. Carver. Thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your thoughtful feedback on my work. You're absolutely correct that I haven't yet accounted for the environmental factors you mentioned, such as wind shear and seismic activity. My current model is still in the early stages, and I plan to further refine it to account for these variables. Your insight into structural stability is invaluable, and I would be open to discussing potential collaborations or advice on how best to approach these additional variables. I believe this is the next logical step in validating the theory. Thank you again for your time and feedback. I look forward to hearing from you. Best regards. Kendrick Moore. Once he sent the email, Kendrick sat back in his chair, his heart still pounding. This could be the beginning of something huge. Or it could be the beginning of his first real failure. Either way, he wasn't going to shy away from the challenge. The next day, as if the universe were testing him, Kendrick received another email, this time from Ms. Carter. She had been following his progress and had heard about the correspondence with Dr. Carver. Subject: Following up on your theory. Hi Kendrick. I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to check in and see how things are going with the theory. I've heard that you've been in touch with Dr. Philip Carver. That's great. His work is respected in the field, and he's someone you can definitely learn a lot from. If you need any guidance, don't hesitate to reach out. In the meantime, I'm curious, how are you feeling about your progress? Any roadblocks? Let me know if I can help in any way. Best. Ms. Carter. Kendrick read through the email several times before responding. Ms. Carter had been supportive from the start, but now she seemed almost too supportive. It was clear she was excited about the potential of his discovery, but there was a part of Kendrick that couldn't shake the feeling that it might not be enough. Still, he answered her honestly. Subject: Following up on your theory. Hi Ms. Carter. Thanks for checking in. Things are moving along, but I'm facing some new challenges. Dr. Carver raised some good points about environmental factors I haven't yet accounted for, wind shear and seismic activity, to be specific. I'm not sure how to incorporate those yet, but I plan on revising the model to include them. It's a bit overwhelming, but I'm determined to get it right. I'll keep you posted as I make progress. Thanks again for all your support. Kendrick. Kendrick felt a weight lift off his shoulders after sending the email. Talking about his struggles felt oddly comforting, especially knowing that Ms. Carter was on his side. The next few days were filled with research. Kendrick scoured papers, textbooks, and online resources on wind shear, seismic forces, and their impact on structural integrity. He was gaining an understanding, but the complexity of these factors made him realize just how much more there was to learn. By the end of the week, Kendrick had revised his model again, this time with additional variables to account for wind and seismic activity. But the real challenge, he knew, would come when he finally tested the theory under these new conditions. He needed to find a way to apply this new version to something tangible, something that would prove his work. That Friday afternoon, as he sat in his room surrounded by pages of notes and equations, Kendrick couldn't help but think about how far he had come. This wasn't just some math homework anymore. This was a journey, one that was about to change everything. Kendrick woke up on Saturday with a sense of purpose that was almost overwhelming. He had spent the past few days refining his theory, incorporating new variables, and testing his equations against models of real-world forces. But today, he would have to take the final step, putting his theory to the test. It had been easy to sit in his room and scribble equations, easy to imagine how the math worked in theory. But now, he was going to test it with the kind of data that would determine if everything he had worked for was actually worth something. As Kendrick sat down at his desk, his eyes lingered on the phone in his hand. He had been thinking about calling Dr. Carver, about reaching out to him for advice on how to proceed. But Kendrick hesitated. There was a part of him that was still afraid to let someone see his work up close, afraid that the theory might not be as groundbreaking as he thought it was. What if Dr. Carver found flaws in it? What if it fell apart under scrutiny? But Kendrick couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. If he wanted to prove that this theory had real value, he had to take the leap. And today would be the first step. Kendrick had decided that the best way to test his theory was to apply it to something tangible, something with measurable forces. The perfect candidate was the nearby bridge that spanned the river just outside of town. Kendrick had walked across it countless times, marveling at the way the structure seemed to defy gravity, standing firm despite the constant battering of wind and water below. He had always wondered how engineers managed to build something so strong, so enduring, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his theory might help explain how forces like wind and water interacted with the materials of the bridge. His plan was simple. He would use his equations to calculate the stress distribution across the bridge's support beams, factoring in the forces of wind and potential seismic shifts. If his theory was correct, the numbers should align with the bridge's actual design, giving him confirmation that he was on the right track. But there was one problem: Kendrick didn't have access to the bridge's structural data. He couldn't see the calculations that had gone into its construction, and that made the whole thing feel like a shot in the dark. It was then that he realized, he didn't need to have all the data. He just needed to get close enough. If he could gather some basic information, he could make reasonable assumptions and test the theory against the structure's general design. His mind made up, Kendrick grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. The weather was overcast, but the air was cool, which was perfect for a day of testing. He didn't need perfect conditions. He just needed a starting point. The bridge wasn't far from his house, just a 10-minute walk. As he approached, Kendrick marveled at how something so massive could seem so simple in its design. The bridge was built with steel beams and concrete supports, the kind of structure that seemed designed to stand the test of time. The wind wasn't heavy today, but he could feel it tugging at his hair and clothes, and he wondered how much of a role it played in the overall stability of the structure. Kendrick took out his notebook and began sketching the bridge. He marked down the basic dimensions, the length of the bridge, the height of the support beams, and the distance between the piers. Then, he started calculating the theoretical forces. He had already worked out the basics of how wind and seismic forces would affect the structure, but now, he was putting it into action. He started by calculating the force distribution of wind along the surface of the bridge. It was a simple calculation. Wind speed, cross-sectional area of the bridge's surface, and the drag coefficient of the material, but it still took time. Kendrick worked quickly, writing down each step methodically, testing the calculations against the basic equations of his theory. The numbers were close. In fact, they were almost spot on. But Kendrick didn't stop there. He needed to test how seismic activity might affect the structure. The equations for seismic forces were more complex, far more so than the wind calculations, but Kendrick had been preparing for this. He had studied how seismic waves moved through different materials, how they propagated across surfaces, and how they interacted with structural supports. With a few assumptions about the bridge's location and the frequency of seismic events in the area, Kendrick was able to apply his theory to predict how the bridge would respond to these forces. The results were promising. The numbers aligned. They weren't perfect, there were still small discrepancies, but they were far closer than Kendrick had ever expected. For the first time, he could see the real-world application of his theory. It wasn't just math, it was tangible, it was practical, and it was alive. He had found something that could actually be used, something that might change the way engineers thought about force distribution in structures. Kendrick couldn't help but smile. He had done it. He had tested the theory, and it had worked. But the satisfaction didn't last long. As he sat there, staring at his calculations, something nagged at him. Something was missing. The numbers were close, but they weren't perfect. There had to be another factor, something small but crucial, that he hadn't accounted for yet. It was the wind. Kendrick realized he had only accounted for the steady, consistent wind. But wind was rarely steady. It shifted, it swirled, it changed direction. The bridge had to be designed not just to withstand constant forces, but to adapt to shifting, unpredictable ones. Kendrick scribbled down a few more equations, factoring in fluctuating wind speeds and variable directions. The new calculations took longer to work through, but once Kendrick finished, the results were almost identical to the actual structural data he had assumed. He had done it. The theory was more than just a rough sketch, it was a real tool for understanding the forces at play in the world around him. Kendrick stood up, feeling the wind against his face. For the first time, he wasn't just a high school student doing homework, he was a young scientist, standing on the cusp of something revolutionary. But even as the excitement swelled inside him, he knew that this was only the beginning. His work wasn't finished. Far from it. He still had to present it, prove it, and refine it further. But for now, as he stood on the bridge looking out over the river, Kendrick felt something he had never felt before, a sense of accomplishment. He had solved the first test. And it felt incredible. The following Monday, Kendrick found himself sitting at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the keys, but he was struggling to compose the email he had been planning to send for the past 2 days. It was time to share his findings with Dr. Carver. The thought of sending the email felt like stepping off a cliff. He had tested his theory against a real-world structure, and the results had been more than promising. But sharing it with someone like Dr. Carver, someone whose expertise in structural engineering was well beyond Kendrick's, was a different kind of challenge. What if Dr. Carver thought he was wasting his time? What if his calculations were wrong, and Kendrick had missed something crucial? But Kendrick couldn't let fear hold him back. He had come this far, and he knew that if he wanted to take this theory further, he had to take the next step, no matter how daunting it seemed. He typed the email carefully, reading and rereading each sentence before hitting send. Subject: the results of my theory, an application to structural engineering. Dear Dr. Carver. I hope this email finds you well. Thank you again for your earlier feedback regarding my theory. I've spent the past few weeks refining the model and testing it with real-world data. Specifically, I applied it to the design of a nearby bridge, taking into account wind shear and seismic forces. The results have been promising. The model predicts force distribution across the bridge with a high degree of accuracy, aligning closely with standard engineering practices. However, I have also found areas where my theory could be further refined, particularly in how it accounts for fluctuating wind conditions and seismic shifts. I would greatly appreciate your thoughts on the results, as well as any guidance on how to move forward. I believe that further testing and refinement will be necessary, and I would be grateful for any advice or suggestions you may have. Thank you again for your time and consideration. Best regards. Kendrick Moore. Kendrick sat back, his heart racing as he hit send. It was done. He had put himself out there, exposed his work to someone who had the power to make or break it. For the rest of the day, he couldn't focus on anything else. Every time his phone buzzed, he found himself hoping for a response from Dr. Carver, even though he knew that it might take days, or even weeks, before he heard anything. The next morning, Kendrick was in the middle of his first period class when the email notification pinged on his phone. He glanced at it, his stomach dropping as he saw the name in the inbox. Dr. Philip Carver. His heart skipped a beat. Kendrick quickly pulled out his phone, excusing himself from the classroom, and stepped into the hallway. With trembling hands, he opened the email. Subject, the results of my theory, an application to structural engineering. Dear Kendrick. Thank you for sharing your findings. I must say, I'm impressed by the work you've done. Applying your theory to an actual bridge structure is a significant step, and your calculation seems solid at first glance. Your ability to incorporate environmental factors, particularly fluctuating wind and seismic shifts, demonstrates a deep understanding of structural forces. That being said, there are a few concerns I'd like to address. The method you used for accounting for fluctuating wind conditions could be further refined. While your approach is a good start, it would benefit from incorporating a more dynamic model, something that accounts for wind gusts and changes in direction on a more granular level. Additionally, your seismic calculations seem to have missed certain frequencies of seismic waves that could affect the structural stability in the long term. I believe you are on the right path, but there are still several areas that require further refinement. I would suggest collaborating with experts in both fluid dynamics and seismic engineering to refine your model. I'd be happy to help connect you with some of these individuals. Keep up the excellent work, and I look forward to seeing how your theory develops. Best regards. Dr. Philip Carver, Ph.D. Senior Researcher, Structural Engineering. Kendrick stared at the email for what felt like an eternity. He had been expecting criticism, but the words in Dr. Carver's response were more encouraging than he had anticipated. He hadn't just pointed out flaws, he had acknowledged the strength of Kendrick's work and suggested ways to refine it further. In that moment, Kendrick felt a surge of relief and pride. He wasn't just a kid playing with equations anymore. He was being taken seriously. His theory had potential. Dr. Carver's endorsement, however subtle, was validation that Kendrick was on the right track. But even with that validation, Kendrick knew that there was still so much more to do. He couldn't rest on his laurels, he had to keep pushing forward, refining his theory, testing it in new ways. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Kendrick's mind was racing as he thought about Dr. Carver's suggestions. He had been right, Kendrick needed to refine his model to account for the dynamic nature of wind and the complex seismic waves that could affect structures. But those challenges didn't intimidate Kendrick. They motivated him. That evening, after dinner, Kendrick sat down at his desk and pulled out a notebook. He began writing down a list of tasks. Refine wind gust model. Research seismic frequencies. Contact experts in fluid dynamics and seismic engineering. Rework equations to include more variables. As Kendrick wrote, a sense of determination settled over him. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. By the time he finished his list, it was late. Kendrick rubbed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion begin to settle in, but he couldn't stop now. He opened his laptop, searching for resources on fluid dynamics. It would be a long road ahead, but Kendrick wasn't afraid anymore. He had faced the first test, and passed. Now it was time for the next challenge. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? It had been a week since Kendrick had received Dr. Carver's encouraging email, and though Kendrick had spent every waking moment refining his theory, he couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had been building inside him. Every time he thought he had it right, something else would pop up, an equation that wasn't quite working, a concept he hadn't fully grasped. There was no shortcut in math, no easy answer. If he wanted to truly change the way engineers thought about structural forces, he had to be thorough. But one thing had become clear: Kendrick couldn't do it alone anymore. He knew it was time to reach out to the experts Dr. Carver had suggested. It wasn't easy to admit, but Kendrick realized that in order to refine his theory, he would need help. Fluid dynamics was a field he had touched on, but he hadn't studied it in depth. The same went for seismic engineering. The complexity of what he was trying to accomplish was beyond anything he could handle without expert guidance. So, after school the next day, Kendrick sat at his desk and pulled up a list of fluid dynamics experts, as well as some researchers in seismic engineering. He had to be strategic. These were professionals at the top of their fields, and reaching out to them could be intimidating. But Kendrick had already come so far. What was the worst that could happen? He began drafting his emails one by one, trying to find the right balance between confidence and humility. He couldn't afford to sound arrogant or naive. He had to present himself as someone who had done the work, someone with a theory that could have real potential, but someone who was also willing to listen and learn. The first email was to Dr. Olivia Reed, a professor in fluid dynamics at a university Kendrick had only heard about in passing. She had published a number of papers on how air moved across structures, and Kendrick was hoping she could help him refine his wind-gust model. Subject: Inquiry regarding fluid dynamics and wind-gust modeling. Dear Dr. Reed, I hope this email finds you well. My name is Kendrick Moore, and I am a high school student working on a theoretical model that addresses how external forces, such as wind and seismic activity, affect structural stability. My current focus is on refining my model's ability to predict wind gusts and their effects on large structures, such as bridges. I've reviewed some of your work on fluid dynamics, and I believe your expertise could provide invaluable insight into improving my model. Specifically, I'm trying to account for the dynamic nature of wind, including gusts and shifts in direction, in order to more accurately predict how these forces interact with a structure. If you would be willing, I would greatly appreciate any feedback or suggestions you may have regarding my approach. I would also love to learn more about your research and how it might relate to the work I'm doing. Thank you for your time and consideration. Best regards. Kendrick Moore. The second email was to Dr. Joshua Chang, an expert in seismic engineering who had published papers on the effects of low-frequency seismic waves on large structures. Kendrick had read a couple of his articles, and although he didn't fully understand all the concepts, he had a solid grasp on the basics. Kendrick was hoping that Dr. Chang could help him refine the seismic component of his theory. Subject: Seismic engineering, request for guidance on seismic wave modeling. Dear Dr. Chang, I hope you are doing well. My name is Kendrick Moore, and I'm a high school student developing a theoretical model that explores the forces, wind, seismic activity, etc., that impact the stability of large structural systems. I've been working to refine my model's ability to account for seismic activity, particularly focusing on how seismic waves of various frequencies affect bridges and other large structures. Having reviewed your work, I believe your expertise could be extremely helpful in improving my model. Specifically, I would appreciate any feedback you could offer regarding how I can better account for seismic frequencies and their impact on structural stability. If you're open to it, I'd also love to hear your thoughts on potential areas for further research in this area, as I continue refining my work. Thank you so much for your time. Best regards. Kendrick Moore. The emails were sent. Kendrick sat back in his chair, staring at his inbox and hoping for a response. His stomach twisted. He had put himself out there, and now, all he could do was wait. It was a strange feeling, waiting for feedback from professionals whose work he had admired from a distance for so long. The next day, Kendrick barely managed to concentrate in class. Every time his phone buzzed, he couldn't help but check it, hoping for a reply. By the time the final bell rang, he was both hopeful and anxious. He rushed home, practically running through the front door, and pulled out his phone to check his email. To his surprise, there was already a response from Dr. Reed. Subject: inquiry regarding fluid dynamics and wind gust modeling. Dear Kendrick, thank you for reaching out, and I'm happy to hear about your work. I'm glad you're diving into the complexities of wind gusts and their effects on structural stability. This is a crucial topic, especially when considering buildings and bridges exposed to dynamic weather conditions. I reviewed your approach and I think you're on the right track. One suggestion I would offer is to integrate a stochastic model that accounts for wind direction changes and gust intensities in a more dynamic way. You might also want to look into turbulence modeling to account for erratic airflow patterns that could affect larger structures, particularly those with more exposed surfaces. I'd be happy to discuss this further if you'd like, and I'm available for a short video chat if that's easier for you. Best regards. Dr. Olivia Reed. Kendrick's heart raced as he read through her email. Dr. Reed had not only acknowledged his work, but she had also provided suggestions that could take his model to the next level. Stochastic modeling. Turbulence modeling. Kendrick hadn't even considered these areas, but they made perfect sense. He felt a surge of excitement. This was the moment that would push him even further. Without wasting a second, Kendrick drafted a quick reply, expressing his gratitude and enthusiasm for the chance to learn more. Subject: inquiry regarding fluid dynamics and wind gust modeling. Dear Dr. Reed, thank you so much for your quick response, and for the helpful suggestions. I'm excited to learn more about stochastic modeling and turbulence modeling. I hadn't considered those before, but they seem like exactly what I need to refine my approach. I'd love to schedule a video chat if that's possible. I'm eager to dive deeper into these concepts and explore how they can be applied to my model. Thank you again for your time, and I look forward to our conversation. Best regards. Kendrick Moore. Kendrick didn't wait long before he saw Dr. Reed's response pop up in his inbox. Subject: inquiry regarding fluid dynamics and wind gust modeling. Dear Kendrick, that sounds great. How does Thursday afternoon work for you? We can schedule a video call then. I look forward to discussing this further. Best regards. Dr. Olivia Reed. Kendrick couldn't believe it. This was it, the beginning of something huge. He had reached out, and now, he was about to speak directly with one of the leading experts in the field. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. But one thing was certain: Kendrick was no longer a high school student playing with theories. He was a young scientist, ready to take the next step. Thursday afternoon arrived, and Kendrick was more nervous than he had ever been. He had spent the entire week reworking his model based on Dr. Reed's suggestions, but he wasn't sure if he was ready. His hands trembled as he sat down at his desk, double-checking his setup. The camera, the microphone, everything was in place. All that was left was to wait for the video call. At exactly 3 p.m., his laptop buzzed, and a video call window popped up. Dr. Reed's name was glowing on the screen. Kendrick's heart leaped into his throat, and for a moment, he froze. He had been preparing for this moment for days, but now that it was finally here, he felt the weight of it all. He took a deep breath, clicked the accept button, and the screen flickered as Dr. Reed's face appeared. She was sitting in front of a large bookshelf filled with textbooks and journals. Her glasses perched on her nose, and she greeted him with a warm smile. "Hello, Kendrick. It's great to meet you virtually. How are you doing?" she asked, her voice calm and friendly. Kendrick forced a smile, though he felt the nerves bubbling under the surface. I'm doing well, thank you. I'm excited to be speaking with you today. Dr. Reed chuckled. I'm glad to hear that. I'm excited to talk about your work, too. From your email, it sounds like you've made some solid progress. Kendrick nodded, trying to push past the nervousness. Yes, I've been working on refining the model based on your suggestions. I've been trying to incorporate stochastic models for wind gusts and turbulence, like you recommended. That's great to hear, Dr. Reed said, adjusting her glasses. I'm curious, how did you go about integrating those models into your existing framework? Kendrick took a deep breath and launched into an explanation. He talked about how he had started by reviewing stochastic processes in fluid dynamics, then worked through several equations to simulate wind patterns more realistically. He explained how turbulence modeling had added complexity to the model, but also made it more accurate, especially when predicting wind behavior around buildings and bridges. Dr. Reed listened intently, nodding along as Kendrick spoke. She occasionally took notes, and Kendrick could see her eyes lighting up when he discussed certain breakthroughs. It was a small reassurance to him that he wasn't completely off track. That sounds like a good approach, Dr. Reed said after a pause. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this. The way you've adjusted the parameters for wind gusts, in particular, seems promising. But one thing I'd advise is to take a closer look at how your model handles boundary layers. In fluid dynamics, boundary layers are critical when analyzing wind flow over structures. Small changes in the boundary layer can drastically affect your results. Kendrick furrowed his brow, thinking back to his work. Boundary layers? Could you explain that a bit more? Dr. Reed smiled. Of course. The boundary layer refers to the thin region of air right next to the surface of a structure where the air velocity changes from zero to the free stream velocity. It's a key area for turbulence models because the flow characteristics there are quite different from the rest of the flow. If you don't account for how the wind behaves in the boundary layer, you may miss critical factors that affect structural stability. Kendrick's mind was racing as she spoke. He had heard the term boundary layer before but hadn't realized just how important it was. So, you're saying that I need to focus more on how wind interacts with the surface of the structure, rather than just the overall flow? Exactly, Dr. Reed said. If you account for the boundary layer in greater detail, your model will be more accurate in predicting how wind gusts interact with buildings and bridges, especially when wind shifts direction suddenly. Kendrick nodded, his thoughts spinning. This was new territory for him, but it made perfect sense. He hadn't fully understood the intricacies of wind flow, and now he was beginning to see where he had gone wrong. Thank you so much for explaining that, Kendrick said, his voice a little more confident. I'll definitely need to revisit that part of the model. Dr. Reed gave him an encouraging smile. No problem at all. You're on the right track, Kendrick. And remember, this process is all about iteration. You'll make adjustments, refine the model, and with each step, it will get better. That's helpful, Kendrick said, feeling a sense of relief. I've also been trying to apply the seismic component to the model, but I'm not sure how to adjust for different frequencies of seismic waves. Dr. Reed raised an eyebrow. Seismic engineering, huh? That's a big leap from fluid dynamics. Kendrick laughed nervously. Yeah, I know. I've been reading Dr. Chang's work on seismic wave frequencies, but it's complicated. I'm not entirely sure how to integrate that into the wind gust model without it getting too unwieldy. Yes, integrating different forces into a single model is always a challenge, Dr. Reed said thoughtfully. One thing you could try is using a multiphysics approach. That means you would model the wind and seismic forces as separate components but combine them at the point where they interact with the structure. You can assign different levels of influence to each force based on their respective magnitudes and frequencies. It's about finding the right balance. Kendrick's eyes widened. A multiphysics approach. It was exactly what he needed. It would allow him to treat each force individually but still understand how they impacted the structure when combined. It was brilliant, and exactly the kind of insight he had been hoping for. "I see what you mean," Kendrick said, scribbling notes furiously. "That's a great suggestion. I think it could make things a lot more manageable." Dr. Reed smiled again. "I'm glad to help. You're making great progress, Kendrick. Just remember, don't be afraid to ask questions and reach out to others when you need help. This kind of work is collaborative, even if you're doing the heavy lifting." Kendrick felt a surge of gratitude. "I really appreciate this, Dr. Reed. I've learned so much in this short conversation." "I'm glad to hear that," Dr. Reed said. "I can tell you've got the dedication and curiosity to make this work. Keep going, and don't hesitate to contact me if you run into any more roadblocks." The call ended shortly after, and Kendrick sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over him. It had been an incredible conversation. Not only had Dr. Reed given him valuable insights, but she had also given him the confidence to push forward with his work. He had come a long way in just a few weeks. And while there was still a lot to learn, Kendrick knew one thing for certain: he was no longer just a student with a theory. He was becoming a part of something bigger. The following weeks were a blur of equations, concepts, and breakthroughs. Kendrick found himself immersed in his theory like never before, and with each step, his model became more refined. The feedback from Dr. Reed had lit a spark in him, and now, his understanding of both fluid dynamics and seismic forces felt sharper. He spent late nights hunched over his desk, combing through research papers, reworking calculations, and experimenting with different models. But Kendrick wasn't alone in this journey anymore. Dr. Reed's encouragement had opened the door for him to reach out to others, and soon enough, he had started communicating with Dr. Joshua Chang as well, who had been kind enough to offer his own insights on seismic activity. Kendrick had never felt more excited about his work. There was something intoxicating about collaborating with professionals who genuinely cared about his project. One Friday afternoon, Kendrick sat down at his desk with a fresh cup of coffee. It was the weekend, but his mind wouldn't rest. He had just finished a long discussion with Dr. Chang about integrating seismic wave frequencies into his model. Dr. Chang had suggested using spectral analysis to break down the different frequency components of seismic waves, which could help him more accurately predict the way those waves would affect a structure. Kendrick knew he was getting closer, but there was still something missing. There was one final piece of the puzzle he hadn't fully grasped yet: how to combine all the forces, wind, seismic, and even the structural behavior, into one cohesive model. He had been working on this for weeks, but it felt like he was approaching the edge of a breakthrough. The pieces were almost in place, but something wasn't quite clicking. And then, in the middle of his calculations, Kendrick remembered something. It was a conversation he'd had with his mom months ago when he had first told her about his interest in structural engineering. She had always encouraged him to find a balance between theory and application, to never forget that the ultimate goal was to solve real-world problems. Her words echoed in his mind now: "It's not about the theory itself, Kendrick. It's about how you apply that theory to the world around you." Kendrick sat up straighter, staring at his computer screen. He had been so focused on the technical aspects of his model. The equations, the calculations, the simulations, that he had overlooked something fundamental. He wasn't just creating a theoretical model for the sake of it. He was trying to build something that could have a tangible impact on the world. His mind raced. The practical implications of his work were enormous. If he could get this model right, if he could refine his theory of how wind and seismic forces interacted with structures, it could change the way engineers designed buildings, bridges, and even entire cities. He wasn't just working with numbers anymore, he was working with the future. Kendrick stood up, pacing around his room. He grabbed his whiteboard markers and started scribbling down his thoughts. He mapped out the key components of his model: wind forces, seismic waves, structural response. The interactions were complex, but there was a way to simplify it, a way to tie everything together. He had to think outside the box. His model needed a unifying framework, one that could connect the various forces he was modeling in a way that made sense not just mathematically, but practically. It needed to be something engineers could use in the real world, not just something that worked in theory. The more Kendrick thought about it, the clearer it became. The answer lay in systems theory. In systems theory, complex systems are understood not as isolated components, but as interconnected parts that function together. It wasn't just about understanding each individual force in isolation, it was about understanding how they work together to create a stable structure. He grabbed his phone and quickly typed a message to Dr. Reed. Subject: seeking your thoughts on system dynamics. Dear Dr. Reed. I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I believe I'm approaching the final stages of refining my model. One thing that I've realized is that I need to combine all the forces, wind, seismic, and structural behavior, into a unified framework. I'm thinking of using concepts from systems theory to create an integrated model that can account for how these forces interact in real-world scenarios. I wanted to ask if you have any thoughts on this approach or if you could point me toward any resources that might help me in applying systems theory to my model. Thank you again for all your support. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Best regards. Kendrick Moore. As he hit send, Kendrick couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with uncertainty. Systems theory was an ambitious approach, but it felt like the right one. If he could pull it off, it would make his model more versatile and applicable in the real world. But there was still a lot of work to do. The next morning, Kendrick woke up to a response from Dr. Reed. He opened his email eagerly. Subject: seeking your thoughts on system dynamics. Dear Kendrick. I'm so glad to hear that you're making such great progress. I think your idea of applying systems theory to your model is brilliant. It's exactly the direction you should be heading in. Systems theory will help you understand the interactions between different forces in a way that is much more practical and cohesive. As for resources, I'd recommend looking into a few key papers on the application of system dynamics to structural engineering. One paper I would suggest is Systemic Approaches to Structural Engineering by Richard Lee, which covers the integration of multiple forces in design. Additionally, I can send you a few textbooks on systems modeling that might help. You're definitely on the right track, Kendrick. Keep pushing forward. Best regards. Dr. Olivia Reed. Kendrick's heart swelled with gratitude. Not only had Dr. Reed validated his approach, but she had also provided him with valuable resources that could help him refine his theory even further. He immediately dove into the material she had suggested. The more he read, the more he realized that this was exactly the framework he had been looking for. He began to see the forces he was working with, wind, seismic, structural, as parts of a larger system. They were interconnected, each one affecting the others in ways that were subtle but critical. With this new perspective, Kendrick felt like he was finally starting to see the whole picture. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and the complex puzzle he had been struggling with for so long had finally clicked into place. As he sat at his desk, surrounded by books and notes, Kendrick couldn't help but smile. He was getting closer to the finish line. And when he finally submitted his theory, he knew it wouldn't just be another math problem, it would be a new way of understanding the world around him. As Kendrick sat down at his desk, his mind buzzed with excitement. He had spent the last few weeks refining his model, taking Dr. Reed's suggestions to heart and incorporating the systems theory framework. With each iteration, the model had grown more sophisticated, and Kendrick had started to feel that he was nearing the breakthrough he had been chasing for so long. But as he glanced at the screen, his excitement began to wane. Something felt off. His calculations were nearly perfect, and the integrations of wind forces, seismic waves, and structural responses were working well within the framework. But there was one variable that kept eluding him, the unpredictable nature of human error. It was a variable he hadn't fully considered before. His mind went back to the real-world applications of his work, the construction of buildings, the design of bridges, the resilience of infrastructure. All of these projects required human hands, human decisions. Whether it was during the construction phase or the ongoing maintenance of these structures, human error was inevitable. And Kendrick realized something: his model had yet to account for the most important variable of all, the people involved. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He hadn't expected to face a new challenge at this stage, but the realization hit him hard. If he wanted his model to be truly applicable to the real world, it couldn't just account for natural forces and structural responses. It had to account for human decisions, too. Human error wasn't something that could be ignored, it had to be modeled, understood, and mitigated. But how? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The issue wasn't just about engineering principles. It was about how those principles were applied by real people under real-world conditions. Could he quantify human decisions and mistakes in a way that would allow his model to still be effective? Kendrick wasn't sure, but he knew one thing: he had to try. After a long, drawn-out sigh, Kendrick grabbed his phone and dialed Dr. Reed's number. He had been hesitant to call her, but at this point, he needed guidance. He couldn't afford to get stuck again, not now. The phone rang twice before Dr. Reed picked up. "Hello, Kendrick. How are things going?" she asked warmly. Kendrick quickly explained his dilemma. "I've been working on the model, and I've incorporated all the major forces: wind, seismic, structural, but I realized something. There's no room in the model for human error. And that's a huge variable, especially in the real world. But I'm not sure how to account for it. Any ideas?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Kendrick could hear Dr. Reed tapping her fingers on the desk, thinking. "Ah, I see what you're getting at," she said slowly. "You're absolutely right. Human error is often the most unpredictable and impactful factor when it comes to real-world engineering. The challenge is how to account for it within a mathematical model." Kendrick sat up straighter, eager for any insight. "Exactly. I mean, I know there's no way to predict every decision a worker might make, but is there a way to model the risk of error? Maybe some kind of probability distribution based on past incidents or common mistakes?" Dar. Reed's voice sounded thoughtful. "That could work. You're looking at this through a probabilistic lens, which makes sense. Human error is often random but can follow certain patterns, especially when you look at large datasets from construction projects, safety reports, or industry standards." Kendrick began to scribble notes furiously. "So, I could integrate human error as a probabilistic factor, something that adjusts the model based on a likelihood of mistakes occurring during construction or maintenance. That could affect the structural integrity over time." Dr. Reed chuckled. "That's exactly the idea. Think of it like this: just as you model turbulence or wind gusts, you could model human error as an external perturbation to your system. It might be small in some cases, but in others, it could have a major impact." Kendrick felt a wave of relief wash over him. The path forward was becoming clearer. "Okay, that makes sense. But how do I quantify human error? I don't have access to data on every construction site, and each worker is different." Dr. Reed paused, and then she said, "That's where you'll need to do some research. Look at industry data, safety records, and case studies. See if there are any patterns in common mistakes, things like miscalculations, improper material usage, or even poor communication among workers. It's not going to be a perfect system, but you can assign a range of probabilities to different types of error." Kendrick nodded, feeling more confident now. "Got it. I'll start looking into industry reports and see if I can build that into the model." "Excellent," Dr. Reed said, her voice filled with encouragement. "And remember, this is part of the process. A good engineer knows that a model is never perfect, but that doesn't mean it can't be useful. By accounting for human error, you're making your model more robust, more adaptable to real-world conditions." Kendrick smiled. "Thanks, Dr. Reed. You've helped me see a whole new side to this." "Anytime, Kendrick." I'm excited to see where this leads you. Just keep pushing forward. As the call ended, Kendrick sat back in his chair, a new sense of determination flooding his body. He was no longer just tweaking an existing model, he was creating something groundbreaking, something that could change the way the industry thought about risk management in engineering. And the key to making it work lay in understanding that even in a world driven by numbers and calculations, people, imperfect, unpredictable people, played a huge role. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur as Kendrick dove into research, pulling up case studies, accident reports, and industry safety standards. He was determined to find the patterns that could help him quantify human error in a way that would make sense in his model. By the time the sun began to set, Kendrick had developed a framework for human error within his system. He had categorized different types of mistakes, from minor miscalculations to more severe failures in communication or procedure. He had also created a probabilistic model that took into account the likelihood of each error occurring in different stages of a project. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As he sat back and looked at the screen, Kendrick felt a sense of pride. His model was evolving, becoming more comprehensive with each new challenge. And he was finally starting to understand the true complexity of the world he was trying to model. The road ahead was still long, but Kendrick was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't just creating a theory anymore. He was building a tool that could shape the future of engineering. Kendrick had never been one to shy away from challenges, but this new phase of his project felt different. He had accounted for natural forces, refined the equations for wind and seismic interactions, and even added a layer for human error. But now, the true test was upon him, integrating all these complex factors into a single, cohesive model. He wasn't just building a theory anymore, he was shaping the future of structural engineering. The weight of the task weighed heavily on his shoulders. Kendrick had spent countless nights poring over textbooks, journals, and case studies. He had mapped out formulas on whiteboards, scribbled notes on napkins, and crunched numbers on his laptop until his eyes blurred from exhaustion. And yet, every time he felt he was getting closer to a breakthrough, something would go wrong. His model would behave unpredictably, the results wouldn't align, or a new challenge would arise that he hadn't anticipated. It was now early March and Kendrick was sitting in his small, cluttered bedroom, surrounded by open books and papers. His eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was so close. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. Kendrick glanced down to see a message from Dr. Reed. Subject, checking in on your progress. Hi Kendrick. I just wanted to check in and see how things are going with your model. Have you made any breakthroughs lately? I know you're working hard, but remember to take a step back when things get tough. Sometimes the best insights come when you least expect them. Let me know if you need anything. Best. Dr. Reed. Kendrick smiled, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He appreciated Dr. Reed's words more than she knew. With everything going on in his life, his mother's health, the pressure of this project, and the looming deadlines, he had forgotten to take a breath and enjoy the process. But now wasn't the time to relax. Kendrick quickly typed out a response. Subject, checking in on your progress. Hi Dr. Reed. Thanks for checking in. It's been a roller coaster of a few weeks. I've managed to incorporate human error into the model, and I'm now in the process of testing it. The interactions between the different forces are more complex than I imagined, and there's still a lot of fine-tuning to do. I'm confident I'm on the right track, but it feels like I'm just one breakthrough away from making it all work. I'll keep you updated and would love to discuss it with you further when I have something solid to show. Best. Kendrick Moore. After hitting send, Kendrick turned his attention back to his screen. He was stuck. Again. His model was close to working, but something wasn't clicking. He could see the pattern, but it was as if a piece of the puzzle was missing. His latest set of simulations, designed to predict how a building would behave under both seismic forces and wind, were chaotic. Some of the simulations produced reasonable results, while others veered into the realm of the absurd, with buildings bending and warping in ways that defied the laws of physics. Kendrick sighed and rubbed his temples. Frustration gnawed at him. What was he missing? As he sat there, the room seemed to close in on him. The weight of his self-imposed deadlines, the expectations from Dr. Reed, and the looming question of whether he could finish this project in time for the engineering conference felt suffocating. He leaned back in his chair, letting his mind wander. Then, something clicked. It wasn't in the equations or the data, but in his approach. He had been so focused on the theory and the numbers that he had lost sight of the bigger picture. He wasn't just trying to build a mathematical model, he was trying to build something that was practical, usable, and reliable. He needed to step back and think about the way real-world engineers worked, not just the physics behind the forces, but the ways in which they navigated uncertainty, problem-solved, and adapted to challenges in the field. Kendrick's thoughts drifted back to his summer internships during his undergraduate years. He had spent time shadowing senior engineers, watching as they faced problems that didn't have clean, straightforward solutions. There was one engineer in particular, someone Kendrick had admired for his calm demeanor and inventive thinking, who had always said, "There's no perfect solution. There's only the solution that works for now." That was it. Kendrick needed to build a model that wasn't perfect. No model would be perfect, but one that was flexible. He had spent so long trying to get everything just right, but in the real world, there were no guarantees. Conditions changed, mistakes were made, and unexpected challenges arose. His model needed to be adaptable, capable of providing insights even when things didn't go according to plan. Without hesitation, Kendrick began to revise his approach. He stopped trying to find a single, perfect equation to tie everything together and instead started breaking the model down into smaller, more manageable components. Each force, wind, seismic, human error, would still be part of the system, but the interactions between them would be treated more like variables with a range of possible outcomes, rather than fixed constants. This would allow the model to adapt based on real-time data, predictions, and decisions made during construction. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a solution that could work in the real world. The idea felt right. Kendrick felt a sense of exhilaration sweep over him as he adjusted his equations. He wasn't trying to predict the future with absolute certainty anymore, he was creating a tool that could help engineers make better decisions in the face of uncertainty. Just as he finished adjusting the final variables, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from his mom. Subject, just checking in. Hey Kendrick. How's everything going? I know things have been stressful lately. Don't forget to take care of yourself, okay? We're all proud of you and excited to see where this goes. Love you. Mom. Kendrick smiled softly, his heart swelling with gratitude. His mom's unwavering support had kept him going through the toughest days. He sat back in his chair, his eyes scanning the screen one last time. The pieces were finally coming together. Kendrick had no idea if his model would work perfectly, but he knew it was something different. It wasn't just a theoretical exercise anymore, it was a tool that could make a real difference. For the first time in a long while, Kendrick felt like he was on the verge of something groundbreaking. All it took was a shift in perspective. And now, with a renewed sense of clarity and purpose, he was ready to tackle the final leg of this journey. The morning of the conference arrived with a stillness that didn't match Kendrick's pounding heart. His alarm had gone off at 6 a.m., but he had already been awake, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. The hotel room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the building as it adjusted to the warming sunlight outside. Kendrick sat up slowly, letting the gravity of the day sink in. This was it. The National Undergraduate Research Conference in Engineering was being held at the University of Chicago, a prestigious event attended by professors, researchers, graduate students, and industry professionals. Kendrick had been selected to present in a special session on innovative applications in structural dynamics. It was a huge honor, and one he had earned through sheer grit, sleepless nights, and the relentless pursuit of his theory. Now he was here, a 19-year-old black kid from Southside Atlanta, about to stand in front of a room full of experts and pitch an unpublished math theory he'd once scribbled on the back of a worn-out homework assignment. As he zipped up his jacket and smoothed the wrinkles in his slacks, Kendrick's phone vibrated with a text message. "Mom. You got this, baby. Just tell your truth. Proud of you no matter what." He smiled, warmth blooming in his chest. He closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself in the voice of the woman who had lifted him through the hardest times. The conference venue was buzzing with energy when Kendrick arrived. Students and professors moved between breakout rooms, clutching programs and steaming coffee. He checked in, collected his badge, Kendrick Moore, Georgia Institute of Technology, and made his way toward the designated presentation hall. The nerves hit harder the moment he stepped inside. Rows of chairs faced a small podium and a screen. The setup was modest, but the people in the audience were anything but. Kendrick immediately spotted a few faces he recognized from academic papers he had cited, including Dr. Miguel Solano, a well-known expert in earthquake-resistant structural systems. And in the second row, seated casually with her notebook on her lap, was Dr. Olivia Reed. She caught his eye and smiled, nodding once. Kendrick swallowed hard and tried to focus on his breathing. He waded through the first two presenters, clapping politely, but barely absorbing what they said. His mind kept flipping through the slides he had prepared, second-guessing everything from his introduction to the final conclusion. What if they thought his theory was amateur? What if someone asked a question he couldn't answer? But then he remembered what Dr. Reed had told him during their last Zoom call: "You're not here to impress them. You're here to share something only you could have built. That's the power you hold." When the moderator finally called his name, Kendrick stood, walked up to the podium, and took a deep breath. "Good morning," he began, his voice even. "My name is Kendrick Moore, and today I'll be presenting a theory I've developed over the past 6 months, a model that integrates wind dynamics, seismic activity, and human error into a unified systems framework for predicting structural behavior." A few heads tilted with interest. He clicked to the first slide. Kendrick walked them through the evolution of his model, beginning with a simple classroom problem that had grown into a multidisciplinary framework. He showed them how wind pressure coefficients and seismic waveforms could be modeled as dynamic inputs into a system governed by probabilistic decision trees, designed to account not only for natural forces but also the variability of human implementation. It was complex, yes, but Kendrick broke it down with clarity, passion, and intention. He noticed heads nodding as he explained how he had sourced real-world safety incident data to model construction stage vulnerabilities. And when he reached the part where his system adjusted outcomes in response to both predictable forces and unpredictable variables, like a late concrete pour or a misaligned steel beam, the room fell quiet with focus. He ended his presentation with a quote from his mother. "It's not just about making something that stands. It's about building something that lasts, even when life doesn't go according to plan." Kendrick looked out at the audience. "My hope is that this model can help engineers build structures that are not only resilient to the forces of nature but to the very human challenges that exist in every project." Applause filled the room. As Kendrick stepped back from the podium, hands shaking, he felt a wave of relief rush over him. He had done it. He had presented his theory. Whether or not they liked it, whether or not it went anywhere from here, he had done what once felt impossible. Then came the Q&A. A professor from Purdue asked about the reliability of his data sources. Kendrick responded confidently, citing 3 independent datasets and explaining his method for verifying accuracy. Another researcher asked how adaptable his system would be in low-income or developing regions. Kendrick leaned forward, energized. "That's actually one of the main goals. By making this model scalable and by using open-source software tools, I want it to be accessible to engineers everywhere, regardless of budget or resources." Even Dr. Solano spoke up, complimenting Kendrick's ingenuity. "You've combined several difficult domains into something quite promising. I'd be interested in seeing how your model handles nonlinear behavior during cascading failure events. Kendrick's eyes widened slightly. I've actually been experimenting with incorporating fail-safe algorithms into the model's structural response layer, he replied. It's still early, but I think it's promising. After the session, Kendrick stepped into the hallway, his pulse finally slowing. Dr. Reed joined him a moment later, grinning. I'm speechless, she said. You held your own in a room full of people who've been doing this for decades. That's not just impressive, it's rare. Kendrick gave her a tired smile. I was terrified the whole time. You didn't show it. She paused, then added, you know, I've been to a lot of these conferences. And I've seen a lot of smart people talk about brilliant ideas. But what you just did? That was different. That came from somewhere deeper. He looked down at his badge, fingers brushing the printed name. Do you think it's enough? He asked quietly. I think it's more than enough, Dr. Reed said. And I think this is only the beginning. Kendrick exhaled, the tension releasing from his shoulders. For the first time, he believed it too. It took less than 24 hours for word of Kendrick's presentation to start making waves beyond the conference. By the time he got back to Atlanta, his inbox had exploded, messages from curious researchers, LinkedIn invites from young engineers, and even an email from a senior editor at a mid-tier academic journal asking if he'd considered submitting a paper. But what caught Kendrick most off guard was the email that arrived late Tuesday night from a professor at MIT. Subject: Potential Collaboration Opportunity. Kendrick. I had the chance to review notes from your conference session in Chicago and spoke with a few colleagues who attended. Your work on integrating structural forces with human decision modeling is one of the most compelling ideas I've heard in years. I'd love to discuss it with you further and explore a possible collaboration. Let me know if you're open to a Zoom call later this week. Best. Dr. Lena Ortiz. Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Kendrick reread the email 3 times, half convinced it was some elaborate prank. MIT? He hadn't even applied there back in high school. It had always felt too far, too expensive, too elite. And now someone from their faculty wanted to collaborate. He stared at the screen, heart thudding, fingers frozen over the keyboard. He eventually typed a simple reply, yes, I'd be honored. Let me know what time works best for you. But it wasn't just academia taking notice. 2 days later, his TikTok DMs blew up after someone uploaded a shaky clip from the end of his talk, with the quote from his mother and his closing line about building something that lasts, even when life doesn't go according to plan. The caption read, "Bro just changed engineering forever and looked calm doing it." Within hours, it had racked up 500,000 views. Soon after, Kendrick's account, mostly filled with videos of equations, memes, and occasional late-night thoughts, was being flooded with comments. Wait. This is the same guy. This is Black STEM excellence. Where's the full theory? I wanna read it. My lil cousin needs to see this, he thinks math isn't for him. Kendrick sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, completely stunned. He had gone from being laughed at over a too ambitious homework assignment to being tagged in posts calling him the future of structural resilience. His pinned comment under the viral video just said, "If y'all only knew how close I was to quitting a few months ago." It all felt unreal. But maybe the most surprising part. It didn't scare him. For the first time in his life, Kendrick felt like he had stepped fully into who he was meant to be. Still, the work wasn't finished. That weekend, he met with Dr. Reed in a quiet cafe near campus to talk next steps. The two sat in a back booth with Kendrick's laptop open between them, sketching out a plan for peer review, possible journal submission, and, if they moved fast enough, a chance to pitch the work for a competitive grant. "You're going to need help with this," Dr. Reed said between sips of coffee. "If this becomes real, like, real, you won't be able to do it alone. You'll need a team. You'll need co-authors. You might even need legal counsel. Legal? Kendrick asked, eyebrows raised. Just to make sure your intellectual property is protected, she explained. Your model is still unpublished. And now that it's catching attention, you need to make sure someone doesn't take it and run. Kendrick hadn't thought about that. Until now, it had all felt personal. A puzzle he had solved for himself. But Dr. Reed was right, this wasn't just an academic curiosity anymore. It was valuable. It had potential impact. And that meant protecting it. He nodded, then looked down at the final slide of his presentation, still open on his screen. Designed for resilience. Built for real life. I guess I need to stop thinking like a student, Kendrick said. And start thinking like a professional. Dr. Reed smiled, tapping a knuckle against the table. You're catching on. They stayed another hour, drawing up a roadmap. Kendrick would continue refining the mathematical documentation and prepare a full draft of his research paper. Dr. Reed would connect him with a former colleague, a structural engineer who had transitioned into patent consulting. If the model passed internal scrutiny, they'd submit to the Journal of Structural Modeling and Systems Engineering by summer. After they parted ways, Kendrick walked the long way home, earbuds in, listening to a playlist that had carried him through long nights of debugging and sleepless revisions. Kendrick's thoughts drifted back to his mother's kitchen, where he first started sketching ideas on the back of grocery receipts while dinner cooked. So much had changed, but some things stayed the same. He still wore the same battered sneakers, still ate ramen on long study nights, still talked to himself while pacing in circles around his room. But now, people were listening. Back at home, his mother was waiting on the porch when he returned. She had a soft blanket draped around her shoulders and a plastic mug of tea in her hand. You look tired, she said with a smile. I'm exhausted, Kendrick admitted, dropping onto the step beside her. But the good kind. She passed him her tea, and he took a sip. Lukewarm but sweet, just the way she liked it. They talkin' about you on the internet, she said. He laughed, nodding. Yeah, I saw. I always knew you'd be special, Kendrick. But I gotta admit, math? Didn't see that one coming. They both chuckled. Kendrick rested his head on her shoulder. For a long moment, they just sat there, watching the stars blink faintly in the polluted sky. Then she said, just promise me something. What? No matter how far you go with all this. Don't forget who you are. Don't forget where you come from. I won't, he said softly. Because how could he? Every part of this journey, from the rusted windows of his high school to the loneliness of being the only black student in some of his college math lectures, had shaped him. Every late night, every doubt, every laugh and every loss had poured itself into the math. It wasn't just numbers and theories. It was memory. It was survival. And now, it was legacy. The cursor blinked at the top of the page like it was daring him to stop. Kendrick stared at the blank Word document, heart thumping in his chest. This was it. Not a class paper, not a late-night brainstorm or a scrappy prototype in a spiral notebook, this was the paper. The one that would take his model out of his hands and into the scrutiny of professionals across the country, maybe even the world. He titled the document, A Multi-Factor Predictive Model for Structural Behavior Under Integrated Human and Environmental Stressors. It sounded official. Maybe too official. He hesitated, then cracked his knuckles and got to work. Writing the paper wasn't the hard part, at least not in the way people expected. Kendrick knew his theory inside out. The variables, the logic trees, the failure probabilities, even the integration syntax across the different force types. What made it hard was deciding how much of himself to put in. He wanted to sound professional, sure, but he also wanted the truth to shine through. So he opened with a single sentence. This model was born not out of a lab, but a kitchen table in South Atlanta, while my mom simmered oxtail stew and I tried to make sense of a homework assignment I refused to accept as good enough. He smiled, satisfied. Then he dove into the formal sections: abstract, introduction, literature review, methodology. Days passed in a blur. Kendrick barely ate. He slept in chunks, naps, really, between editing sessions and Zoom calls with Dr. Reed. She was relentless, in the best way. Pushing him to clarify ideas, cite sources, tighten logic. She didn't go easy just because the work was groundbreaking. That wasn't how respect worked in academia, or in real life. At one point, after an especially brutal round of notes, Kendrick texted her. "Do you secretly enjoy making me rewrite the same sentence 11 times?" She replied, "If you think 11 is a lot, you're not ready for peer review." Relieved face. On the fourth day, Kendrick finally sat back in his chair and exhaled. The paper was complete: 32 pages, 8 diagrams, 61 citations. He stared at the PDF on his screen for a long time before dragging it into an email draft. His hands hovered over the keyboard. To editorial@jumps.org. Subject: Submission, more_k_ integrated predictive model.pdf. Dear editors, please find attached a research paper for consideration. Send. It was done. And now came the waiting. The following weeks felt like limbo. Kendrick tried to focus on his classes, his job at the campus IT desk, even a few new equations he'd been tinkering with, but his mind kept returning to the paper. Had he used too many personal anecdotes? Would they think the model was too unconventional? Was he still just the kid who got lucky, in their eyes? Dr. Reed assured him that silence was normal. Peer-reviewed journals don't move fast, she explained. Just because your theory got attention doesn't mean the system skips steps. If it's solid, it'll hold up. Her faith helped. But the doubt lingered. Then, one afternoon in late April, Kendrick was sitting on the campus quad, half-heartedly reading for his applied statistics class, when his phone buzzed. From editorial@jumps.org. Subject: Paper decision, more_k_ integrated predictive model.pdf. His heart dropped into his stomach. He tapped the notification, barely breathing. Dear Mr. Moore. After thorough peer review by 4 independent experts in structural modeling and systems engineering, we are pleased to inform you that your paper has been accepted with minor revisions for publication in our upcoming issue. Kendrick didn't finish reading the rest. He stood up. Let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in his chest for a year. Then he texted one person. To Mom. Message: they accepted it. I'm going to be published. She called immediately. No words at first, just crying. Kendrick didn't realize until that moment that he was crying too. Over the next week, Kendrick worked through the revision notes, clarifying a few terms, strengthening his references, and adjusting one of the graphical models for clearer readability. The feedback had been firm but respectful. Most of the reviewers noted the same thing: this model is unconventional but timely, and shows significant potential for real-world application. The journal scheduled the publication for early summer, and Kendrick's name was officially listed in the index. Kendrick Moore, Georgia Institute of Technology. Word spread fast. His engineering department sent out a congratulatory email. A professor he barely knew from another university tweeted about the paper, tagging Kendrick. LinkedIn blew up again. A local Atlanta news station reached out for an interview. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a short profile with the headline: From homework to high impact, Atlanta student's math theory gains national attention. Even his old high school principal emailed to invite him back to speak at next year's senior awards banquet. The noise was exhilarating. And exhausting. At the end of a long day full of emails, Kendrick sat down with Dr. Reed in her office. They hadn't had a chance to just talk since the acceptance. You made history, she said, handing him a cup of tea. He shook his head. I just submitted a paper. You submitted a paper that merged theoretical math, structural engineering, and behavioral science, and got it published as an undergrad. That's not just unusual. That's unheard of. Kendrick looked down at the mug, letting her words settle. It still doesn't feel real. It won't. Not right away. She paused. You remember when I laughed at your homework that day? He chuckled. Yeah. Kinda hard to forget. I wasn't laughing at you, Kendrick. I was laughing at the idea that a student had just turned in something that didn't belong in a high school class. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. You reminded me what it felt like to be surprised by genius. Kendrick looked up, caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. You scared me a little, she added. In a good way. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Kendrick said, I was scared, too. Still am. Good, she said. Stay scared. But don't ever stay silent. That night, Kendrick took a walk through campus, headphones in, hoodie up, just letting the cool air wrap around him. He passed buildings he'd studied in, cried in, pulled all-nighters in. He passed the engineering lab where the model had first worked. He passed the lecture hall where he'd once sat in the back row, too nervous to raise his hand. Now his name was in journals. People were using his theory to guide real-world decisions. And yet he felt more grounded than ever. Not like a genius. Not like a celebrity. Just like Kendrick Moore, the kid who never stopped asking what if. He paused at the top of the stairs outside the student union and looked up at the stars. Then he opened his notes app and typed one line. Next up, a model that adapts in real time to construction phase shifts. No one's done that yet. Then he smiled. Because someone would. And maybe that someone would be another kid with a half-wrong answer on a homework sheet and a head full of impossible questions. The gym at Kendrick's old high school looked smaller than he remembered. The bleachers were packed with students, teachers, and proud families. The air buzzed with that strange electric mix of anticipation and awkward formality that always surrounded high school awards night. Streamers in red and white hung from the ceiling. A folding table at the front held a row of plastic trophies and paper certificates. But everyone's eyes were on Kendrick. Please welcome back one of our most distinguished alumni, the principal said into the mic, a young man whose brilliance was once underestimated, until it changed the world. Mr. Kendrick Moore. Applause erupted. A few students whooped from the back row. Kendrick smiled, adjusting his mic as he stepped up to the podium in a fitted navy blazer and sneakers still worn at the heels. He looked out across the crowd. He could see the spot in the bleachers where he used to sit, quiet and unnoticed. He spotted Mr. Daniels, his old math teacher who once told him to keep things simpler next time. There were new faces too, kids who looked just like he had, smart, tired, full of questions and unsure if anyone would ever take them seriously. Kendrick cleared his throat and began. I used to sit where you're sitting right now. I'd watch people walk across this stage and think, they've got it all figured out. I didn't. Not even close. I wasn't valedictorian. I wasn't even popular. I was the kid who got in trouble for writing equations that looked like gibberish to everyone else. Some of the students laughed. The teachers nodded knowingly. I remember one assignment where I got marked down for doing it the wrong way. But the wrong way turned out to be the start of a theory that eventually got published in a national engineering journal. The gym went quiet. I'm telling you this because some of you are probably feeling like I did. Like you don't quite belong. Like the world already decided what your ceiling is. Like maybe people look at you and only see a stereotype, a mistake, a background character. Kendrick let that land. A few students were frozen, eyes locked on him. But I'm standing here to tell you, your ceiling isn't real. It's just a reflection of someone else's imagination. You get to rewrite it. You get to redefine it. He smiled. I'm not here tonight because I was the smartest. I'm here because I didn't give up. Even when the math didn't make sense. Even when I felt like a joke. Even when I wanted to quit, and the only thing keeping me going was my mom's voice in the next room saying, "You were made for more." He paused, scanning the bleachers. Some of you are gonna become artists, engineers, activists, teachers, or parents who raise the next generation of thinkers. Whatever you do, don't shrink yourself to fit into the space someone else gave you. Make a new space. The audience applauded again. This time slower. Heavier. A real clap that meant we feel that. After the ceremony, Kendrick stood by the trophy table as students approached him one by one. A shy girl in an oversized hoodie handed him a napkin with a physics problem scribbled on it and asked if he could look at it. A junior with braces told him he wanted to go into civil engineering but wasn't sure he was smart enough. "You're asking the right questions," Kendrick said, scribbling his email down. "That means you're already ahead." Later, as he walked the halls of the school, Kendrick passed by the trophy case. There, next to dusty plaques from decades past, was a new edition, a framed newspaper clipping with his name beneath the headline. Local Students' Theory Makes National Impact. He didn't stop. He just nodded at it like it was an old friend and kept walking. Back in Atlanta, life settled into a strange, beautiful rhythm. The paper's publication opened more doors than Kendrick had imagined. He was invited to speak at conferences, consulted on infrastructure projects in cities facing climate risk, and accepted a summer research internship at MIT with Dr. Ortiz's team. He also joined a volunteer mentoring program for underrepresented STEM students. Once a week, he met with 3 high schoolers, 2 girls and a boy, over Zoom. They didn't know much about structural math yet, but they asked the best questions. Kendrick saw pieces of himself in all of them. One afternoon, during a mentoring session, the boy, Eli, asked, "What made you not give up?" Kendrick thought about that for a long moment. "I guess. I realized that the stuff I was building in my head mattered, even if no one else saw it yet. And eventually, I stopped waiting for permission to believe in it." Eli nodded slowly, like he was storing that away for later. It was during that summer at MIT that Kendrick found himself sitting alone in the campus library one evening, staring at the corner of his notebook where he'd once written, "What if the real variable is chaos?" He smiled, tapping his pen on the desk. The world was full of variables: earthquakes, wind, faulty systems, distracted builders, doubters, fear, faith, love. No structure was perfect. But they could still be resilient. Just like people. Kendrick looked out the window as the sun dipped low behind the buildings. He opened a new page and wrote the title of his next paper idea. Dynamic Feedback Loops in Real-Time Construction Safety Models. He had a feeling this one would be bigger. And somewhere, in a quiet classroom back in Atlanta, a teacher handed out an assignment. A girl in the front row frowned at the last question. It was weird, open-ended, and full of strange constraints. She raised her hand and asked, "What's this even supposed to mean?" The teacher smiled. "That's actually based on a theory by a former student here. His name's Kendrick Moore." The girl tilted her head. "Wasn't he the one who got laughed at for turning in some crazy homework?" The teacher laughed. "Yeah. And now he's building models that save lives." The girl looked back at the question. And she started to solve it, her own way. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?